All art is affected by the art preceding it, a product of influences both overt and obscure. Sometimes looking at what was around during the creation of a thing can help explain why the thing is like it is. Context is, as ever, important. Wargames are no exception to this. To that end, we've been slowly working our way through a handful of games released before Warhammer 40k existed that share some connection with it, in an effort to understand the landscape it was birthed from. We've already looked at Laserburn, Brian Ansell's earlier sci-fi skirmish game, and Spacefarers, Games Workshop's earlier sci-fi skirmish game. And so we say, greetings Trimotes and welcome to Codex Compliant.
Let's look at another early sci-fi skirmish game from the people that would give us Warhammer. Combat 3000, infantry combat in the year 3000 with its delightfully blue cover, was released in 1979 by Tabletop Games. It was written by old school friends and future Warhammer designers Richard Halliwell and Rick Priestley, the latter still going by Richard here. And the art was by Tony Yates, Brian Ansell and Nick Bibby. Big thanks to Miranda who sent this original copy to us. She just messaged us out of the blue and said, "Hey, do you want a copy?" To which we said, "Yes, thank you very much." Never thought we'd have an actual physical copy of this thing. Combat 3000 came a year after the Richards released their first commercial game, Reaper Fantasy Wargame Rules, so it's mildly interesting that the pattern of release fantasy first and sci-fi second from Warhammer also held true here. Yes, we know that it only says Halliwell's name on the cover of Reaper. Priestley wouldn't get his name on it until its 2nd edition 1981 Tabletop Games release. But according to interviews we've read, they did both work on the 1st edition too. Also, this isn't super important, but a lot of places online seem to conflate the two editions of Reaper together, so sometimes you'll see it claimed that it came out after Combat 3000. But it didn't. It came out before it in 1978. I think when people talk about Reaper, they're usually talking about the 2nd edition, so things get a little jumbled. Also shows that things getting unnecessarily confusing didn't start with Warhammer.
Before we get into how Combat 3000 works, let's first take a look at the fluff. What is the setting of Combat 3000 like? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? Do we see those familiar grimdark themes of religious extremism, or power-armoured brutes enacting state violence on a subjugated populace? Are there conversion beamers? Just what is going on? Well, it's the year 3000, and there's combat. Oh, and there's a 3-armed monkey. That's about it. Yeah, there's not really much to this from a lore perspective, but that's not shocking. When you're talking about this era of games, even in those ones that did have more elaborate backstories, it was not unusual for them to be fairly mini and setting agnostic. They were providing you with tools, and it was up to you to decide how you wanted to use them. Combat 3000 is really just a set of sci-fi combat rules for any sci-fi combat that you might need to do.
Saying that though, we can't help but wish there was a little something more there. Having a little story behind the game is always good for sparking the imagination, even if you choose not to use it in your own battles. In fact, here is a relevant quote from Rick Priestley he said in an interview with Awesome Lies in 2024.
"It's a shame that we didn't include more background material, as we certainly had an idea of a universe when playing games, because I think that would have helped give the game an identity. If you compare Combat 3000 with a much more well-known Laserburn from Brian Ansell, which came out some years later, the main difference is that Laserburn feels like it belongs in a definite place, whilst Combat 3000 has a sense of being a set of rules you can adapt to suit your own backstory."
Which we think is a fair assessment. The backstory they had in mind was apparently a little Blake 7-ish, with the protagonists being either rebels or pirates, and as someone who brings up Blake 7 whenever he can, I approve of this. Now, don't get us wrong, there are seams of what feel like fluff buried in the equipment names and the like, but since at least one of the bits of equipment is just a Dune reference, I'm comfortable assuming that many of the others are also nods to 60s and 70s sci-fi books we haven't read that one of the Richards just happened to be fond of.
The presentation of the rulebook is very basic by today's standards and almost identical to that of Laserburn, also put out by Tabletop Games. to the point that I'm not sure I'd be able to tell if a random page came from one game or the other at a glance. This is mostly due to the use of the same fonts, and the art being by many of the same people. It also means I can show you 6 guns here and dare any of you to, without looking it up, tell me which 2 come from Combat 3000, which 2 come from Laserburn, and which 2 come from Spacefarers. This is not a criticism, it's just the obvious end result of a lot of the same people working on some very similar games around the same time. There's a sense of community there that's neat to see. Also, here's which came from where. Also, just to put it out there, like those other games, Combat 3000 is prone to idiosyncrasies and vagueness born both of the time period and the fact it was written by people still early in their career. The Richards were both just 20 years old the year this came out, and it was only their second commercial release after all. The upshot of this is that when we start talking about the rules, if we make a mistake, we won't know whether we've actually made a mistake, or the rules are just written in such a vague and circuitous manner that multiple interpretations are possible. You can't exactly download an FAQ PDF for this thing, you know? You had to wait for an expansion to maybe clarify what was unclear, if you were lucky.
Anyway, the Combat 3000 rules were made to be scalable, with certain parts of them swapped in and out depending on the size of the game. For example, big battles forego fiddly things like reloading, and in a smaller roleplay game, a player could ignore target priorities. The one version of the game that uses everything is small actions and skirmishes, so when we're talking about rules, assume that's the type of game we're talking about. How many minis are involved in a small action? No idea. It does not say. It seems to take a stance of just work it out, idiot. To give a rough overview of the game, how Combat 3000 worked is that first you'd give your minis orders. These would be the objectives they're supposed to do during the game. So you would write down something like, go over to that building and hold it, and that's what they'd need to try and do. You also needed to keep track of what happened to them, and every mini would have a record sheet for you to do so on. Because I don't know about you, but the thing I like most about tabletop gaming is filing paperwork. This is one of those things where we think we understand where they're coming from. It feels like an attempt to recreate the tension between the orders soldiers are given and the realities they face on the battlefield, as well as keep track of exactly what's happened to them. But I can't imagine that playing a huge game where you need to file every single soldier's taxes each turn was particularly engaging to anyone but the most perverse of spreadsheet enjoyers. In the modern day, at least, this is a game from a different time that had very different tabletop gaming norms, and we're very outside of our usual sphere here. To a grognard raised playing old historical war games, I'm sure this would all feel very mundane. However, to make this a little less awkward, there was an included list of shorthand codes to represent what they could do, as well as tell you how long they'd take and how many free hands they'd need. Which does mean that they need to state that dropping a weapon takes no hands, which feels like a statement that's both true and false at the same time.
After the orders, you got the close combat phase, and by the way, all players got to go in each phase, there's no separation by player. Any mini charged by another could do a few things. They could run away, they could stand and fire, they could countercharge, or they could just do nothing. Although some were only possible if you'd given them compatible orders earlier. You then needed to determine who got to attack and in what order. To do this, you rolled a d6 and deducted the mini's dexterity rating, their reflex rating, their weapons handling rating, and add 1 if they're fighting more than one opponent. The lower the score, the better, with everything lower than 1 counting as a 1, and anything above 6 meaning a mini can't attack at all. This was because the combat was split into 6 sub-phases, and the result you have told you which of those sub-phases the attack would happen in. It's rolling for initiative, but with more maths, basically. To determine if a melee attack did something, you rolled a 2d10, minus your opponent's reflex, dexterity and strength ratings, as well as the value of their armor, and added your own strength and weapon rating. If the end result was 12+, congratulations, you have killed your opponent. After close combat we got the movement phase, where figures could move an amount of centimeters equal to their movement rating, but could run 3 times it or crawl half of it, as well as other modifiers for more niche movement. Also, there's a Klingon. Apparently.
Then we'd get to the firing phase. And once you'd been through the remarkably long list of requirements to determine if you could see the target, fire at it, and if the person you want to fire at is even eligible to be fired at by that particular mini at that particular time during that particular phase of the moon, as long as they had the correct permission slip signed by their mum, you'd roll to decide which phase they'd fire in, as the shooting was once again split into 6 sub-phases. Once a mini's turn was up, you'd first determine if their shot hit the target. To do this, you took a base chance of hitting of 50% and applied any of these modifiers that applied, as well as the mini's inherent accuracy divined from its accuracy rating and the weapon's stats. You'd then roll some percentile dice, and if you rolled under the number that you were left with, then it counted as a hit. If the opponent didn't have full armour, you'd roll 2d10, add the weapon's effect factor, which in later times would likely have been called something more self-explanatory, like armour penetration, and subtract the target's strength and the value of any partial armour they may be wearing. Again, if the result was greater than 12, the target was dead. There's also a slightly faffier version for minis wearing full armour.
The final phase was the actions phase, where any guff that was in the mini's orders but isn't moving, shooting or punching is done. Well, okay, the actual final phase would be morale, since you have to do that at the end of each turn, but it isn't counted in the official phase listing for some reason. Each human figure had a morale status. This usually starts the game as steady, but there's 7 different states they can be in. Overconfident, confident, steady, shaky, poor, scared, and terrified. Each of those states, apart from steady and poor, modified how they acted, although I think poor not having a status effect was unintentional. For example, overconfident troops had to advance a minimum of half their walk rate and charge enemies if they were able, and terrified troops would hide if under fire, breaking if they weren't in cover. How this worked was, if a figure had some unsettling things happen around them, they had to roll a d6 for a morale test at the end of the turn, apply the appropriate modifiers, and end up with a result that could slip their morale status up or down the list. There were also rules for alien morale that all worked a bit differently, since not all alien races think like humans, rather than having a one-size-fits-all system, which, honestly, is an idea we kind of love. And that's the basic rules of Combat 3000. There's stuff for robots and vehicles and other bits and bobs, but that's a general overview. And I gotta be honest, it seems like an awful lot of stuff around what could be a fairly simple game.
Maybe this is reaching a little, but you can kinda see the beginnings of Warhammer's rule set here. Not in how anything mechanically works, but philosophically. When you get right down to it, there's not really that much complicated going on per mini beyond those modifiers and the paperwork. Especially if you're doing melee between 2 humans, since most of the numbers you need to add or subtract are literally 0. And if you made those modifiers simpler or baked them into the stats a little, you'd end up with a game not totally dissimilar to the original Warhammer, where each individual bit of combat was simple and quick compared to many other games of the era. Combat 3000 isn't there yet. It's bogged down in the tables of modifiers and paperwork common to games from the time, but I don't know, we can sort of see how the people behind this would go on to write Warhammer. But also, we know that they wrote Warhammer later, so maybe we're just projecting this stuff onto it. It's easy to infer a connection in retrospect that may or may not actually be there. We're seeing what being self-aware feels like. Don't know if I like it. Now, although we've not been using authentic 1979 minis for this video, the ones you've seen here are more modern 15mm ones from Ground Zero Games' Stargrunt line, there was a mini line that Combat 3000 is somewhat connected to, a series of sci-fi minis from Brian Ansell's pre-Citadel Miniatures company, Asgard. But you didn't have to use them or anything. This was an era where minis were usually made with the idea that you'd use them for lots of different games, and Asgard is not the only miniature company mentioned as a source for minis in Combat 3000. The Asgard connection just explains why there's those rules for 3-armed monkeys, which are called Trimotes by the way, because that's just a series of minis that Asgard made, which were absolutely riffing on the 3-armed motes from The Mote in God's Eye, because I was right about there being nods to sci-fi novels we haven't read in here. God knows how many others we've missed. Also, we've been using 15mm minis because we felt that that would line up better with the scale of 1cm equaling 1 meter the game works at than larger minis would. Plus, some of the Asgard minis mentioned were available in 15mm. Granted, it seems that a lot of people use 25mm minis for it, but since Combat 3000 itself doesn't really have much to say about what specific scale the minis need to be, we thought that it felt right to use some that were the same size as those Laserburn minis that we already had. As an added bonus, 15mm minis are both adorable and much quicker to paint. Plus, it turns out that scratch building 15mm terrain with whatever stuff you've got lying around the house is pretty fun. Can recommend. This Star Wars-y style building started off as half of a big Kinder Egg capsule.
Oh, and speaking of Laserburn, another similarity this has with Laserburn is that the stats for things could be written simply as a series of numbers. For example, here is an alien known as Amanda Blacks, and here are its stats. Makes perfect sense to me! I'm sure once you've played this for a bit, you'd remember which number represents your movement or your dexterity rating or what have you. But it's one of those things where you start to understand why we put labels on stat sheets these days. It may be less efficient space-wise, but it makes things a lot more user-friendly and saves on unnecessary confusion. Then there's the optional rules you could use if you want, but are only really intended for smaller games where extra layers of complexity are easier to manage. Like each mini having multiple wounds that reduce the stats of the mini as it loses them, or wounds that only affect certain body parts, or wounds, but for guns. Combat 3000 would get an expansion in Combat 3001, or a fistful of credits, in 1981. This time with only Halliwell's name on the cover. Although there is a full page of credits for the others who helped. No game is made in a vacuum after all, and a few of the names here may be familiar to those interested in the early days of Citadel and Warhammer.
Aside from some errata for the main book, Combat 3001 added a lot of things to the game that, in all honesty, just seemed to be complexity for complexity's sake, but that was the style at the time. For example, I'm not sure how often it should come up in a tabletop wargame that Trimotes have below average hearing, but I didn't go on to write Warhammer and Space Hulk, so what do I know? And to be fair, I know that if I'm given rules to play games in different strengths of gravity, that's something I would definitely want to play with. It did also give a little more information on the universe of the game. You know, a smidge, a scent, a whiff of fluff. Like that there are Imperial forces, there is an Imperium, and given a lack of contradictory evidence, we are to assume it is made of humans. An Imperium of man, if you will. We also find out that on at least one world, Ursats, humans and Trimotes coexist, and that there also exists a kind of alien called a Vroom Beast, who can hop around the battlefield and have poor eyesight, presumably on account of most their face being an anus.
So that was Combat 3000, a sci-fi wargame and ancestor to 40k. Just not necessarily a direct one. We weren't able to find any reviews of the game from when it was released. I'm sure they're out there, but there's a limit to how many old tabletop magazines we can skim through on the off chance of finding one. So we're not really sure how it was received at the time, beyond Priestley mentioning in an interview that it and Reaper did alright. To be honest, even modern retrospective reviews are pretty thin on the ground. But even if there isn't much of a legacy to Combat 3000 directly, it, along with Reaper, meant that Priestley and Halliwell were in the right places and in the right orbits in the British tabletop scene to be around Citadel and Games Workshop as they started to take on a more recognisable shape, meaning the pair of them would go on to work on the original Warhammer, as well as numerous other notable projects there like 40k and Space Hulk. It is hard to overstate the impact their work has had on tabletop gaming, and though Halliwell stepped away from games design some time ago and sadly passed away in 2021, Priestley is still writing games, with his most recent Space Battles, A Spacefarer's Guide, coming out just last year.
So whilst Combat 3000 wasn't really a start or end point for anything, it was absolutely a stepping stone along the way.
And those are just as necessary.
Thank you all for watching. Please feed the algorithm your likes and comments if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe for more dives into old Warhammer and Warhammer adjacent topics. If you'd like to support us in this endeavour, then please check out patreon.com/snipeandwib, which not only helps fund these videos, but gets your name in the credits, lets you see these videos a little early, and gives you access to our Patreon exclusive videos, like this one where we play a Transformers Choose Your Own Adventure for reasons that escape me right now. Anyway, take care of each other, and we'll see you next time.